Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Robert Hodges, CEO at Altinity. Robert, introduce yourself.
Hi, Josh. Yes, as you said, that's my current title is CEO at Altinity. Our company markets and supports ClickHouse, a popular data warehouse. I'm actually a data person and have been that for about 37 years. I started in the early 80s while I was in the military with my first database. It was something called M204 or Model 204, very popular database at that time. And then since then, I've worked with about 19 others. So ClickHouse, which is the database I'm currently working on, is number 20. Over that time, I've worked with 6 startups. I worked for the University of Washington, and I've also worked for VMware. So I'm basically a data geek, and I'm very happy about it.
Great. Well, I'm glad to have you on today. As a note for anybody who's listening, Josh is my first name. Everybody calls me JD. But Robert and I have known each other for quite some time. We actually haven't connected in, goodness, about a decade now. But we did previously when you were working with, I believe it was Continuant, we connected through the Postgres conference series.
That's right. I remember them fondly. You even had one at the University of Maryland, which was my alma mater for my bachelor's degree.
Yeah, that was our first East Coast version. You know, we ran in Portland State, or the first few times we ran it at colleges, Portland State, University of Maryland, ran one at Drexel, and then we ran one at Seattle Community. And the Drexel one was kind of the last one we had before the '08 meltdown. Mm-hmm. And so it was, we were growing steadily. We were well over 100. And then there was only like 87 people that showed up to Drexel. And then after that one, we went to, in '09, I think the first one we ran, or '08, late '08, we ran the first one in Philly. And then we went to Manhattan at the Hotel Penn. But I'm curious, Robert, you talk about 37 years of data, but if you creep your LinkedIn, that is not where you started. I mean, you had a focus on medieval and classical studies and a master's in international studies with a focus on Japanese language and political economy. Talk to me about political economy. What is that?
Political economy is the study of the intersection of the economy and the political systems of different societies. So it's where you study things like what are the effects of policies that governments make on economic growth and vice versa, how do economic growth and sort of the structure of the economy then feed back into policies that people choose to follow. And it sounds kind of vague, but it's a field where you might study the kind of things like how the way that defense and warfare causes the economy to be structured in a certain way, which then leads to different sort of policy choices and even organizational choices in the society as a whole. It's a very, very broad field and super interesting.
So that interests me because, without getting deep into politics because of how polarized it is, but from a theoretical standpoint, one of the things you often hear is the government doesn't create jobs. And I can see the argument that the government doesn't create jobs, but on the other hand, it kind of does based on the policies that are set forth. And if we take the modern era of what we're dealing with now with the pandemic, one of the things that I've been kind of chewing on in the back of my head is that a lot of pundits out there like to say, well, the government gave all these people this free money, and it's not free. It's coming out of your paycheck and my paycheck in the form of taxes eventually. But, these pandemic stimulus checks. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is you had a class of people mainly in the service industries that for some time were able to replace their income that they lost through the pandemic. But now in the press, you start hearing things like the Great Exodus. or the great quitting and all these things, where what's happening is a lot of these folks aren't willing to go back to their jobs. And a lot of people, you'll hear them say, well, they don't want to work because they figure if they don't work, the government will take care of them. Now, without getting into that vein of thought, my vein of thought is a little bit different. What has happened is that over the last 24 months, you had a segment of society that suddenly was able to enjoy life on a level that they hadn't previously, due to the energy that would go into work. Now, work is good. Work is wonderful, especially when you're someone like yourself or myself, where we are privileged to have these great careers and live the lives that we lead. But imagine, I mean, Robert, I'm sure you've run into this. I know that I have. If someone calls me on the phone and starts cussing me out, I just fire them as a client. I have that privilege. But someone who is in a coffee shop or is a waitress or is a bartender, they may not have that privilege. And I'm starting to wonder if that class of people, it's not that they don't want to work. In fact, I think that they do want to work, because I think that humans have, generally speaking, have an innate desire to be productive. It's that they're no longer willing to put up with the abuse that often comes in the form of being in the service industry. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and I want to preface this by saying that I'm not an expert on this, and I just observe things like anybody else. But I think there's a couple things that I've seen and that seem relevant to this. One, I think there's just it feels like we have this sort of tearing apart of the basic collaborative spirit of society in many places. And there was a time when people would sort of, have big problems, something like, like COVID, where we would basically pull together and just try and solve it. And I think some of that collaborative spirit has evaporated. And so I think that's, as a result, people are stressed out. They're, coming into a restaurant, their lives are stressed, under stress. The restaurant is having problems because they can't hire enough people. So they don't get good service, and they're just, sort of reaching at, sort of snapping at the people that serve them. That certainly has happened. And it seems, at least anecdotally, well documented. And so I think you can't blame people that are in those jobs if they have, if they have options, they might do something else. I think that what's happening, though, in California at least, is there's also another factor, which is that COVID just really messed with the economy in a bunch of really bad ways. Take the wine industry, which is pretty big north of where we live in the Bay Area. Once COVID got started, people, first of all, many of them lost their jobs, and they're living in a place that's already relatively expensive. They just moved away. And so it's not that they're there and they don't want to work. They're just not there anymore. And I've talked to multiple people who have this problem of just not being able to find staff. And so as a result, as these businesses are coming back online, they just can't find the staff. Another thing that has happened in California is places outside of cities have become more expensive. For example, Lake Tahoe is a great example where rents are going up. Because a bunch of people moved out there, people like you and me who can work remotely are now living out in Lake Tahoe, and that is causing rents to go up. So again, people who were working in these service industry jobs are getting pushed out because they can't afford the rent. The businesses are not necessarily doing that well. So I think it's sort of there's a lot of turmoil in the market, and it may take some time for this, to settle down and for people to find an equilibrium. Right now, we're not there.
Well, I would agree. And I mean, if you bring in the economies of it, one of the things that a lot of people have started coming to terms with is so if you were to hire myself, I don't hire out anymore, but if you were to hire myself, I hire out at a rate, right? That's what we're used to is, $250, $300 an hour, whatever the rate is. Just like with an attorney, our attorney is the same rate. It doesn't matter if, we're in Texas or we're in Washington. He's X amount of dollars per hour. And what's happening, and I've been talking with a lot of folks that are in their late 20s, early 30s, and they have this mindset that it shouldn't matter where I am because, my rate is X. And explaining to them the basic economics of, well, that doesn't actually work as an employee. It works as a contractor, but as an employee, it doesn't work because your salary is tied to the cost of living of where you're at. And you have a lot of individuals now that are trying to say, well, I want a Bay Area salary while I live in, say, Phoenix, as just as an example. And they don't quite grasp why that doesn't work. And it's actually tied into exactly what you just said, is that if you end up in a scenario where you have a lot of people that move out of one area into another, say Lake Tahoe, another place this is happening is where I live, which is Bellingham, Washington. If you get a lot of, let's say, not necessarily white collar, but certainly, people that are making the upper end of wages across the bell curve. And then all of a sudden you get an influx of individuals who are making, say, Bay Area salaries, but we're paying for, Phoenix area prices. That's going to drive up costs across the board for the economies that are used to being cheaper. And then suddenly they get pushed out even farther into other small towns, or and you get people who are traveling farther to get to their jobs. Classic places, New York, where, officers of New York, they don't live in New York. They live in one of the other boroughs because they can't afford Manhattan, for example. And I don't know. It's just it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next, because I think that this is going to be a multi-year transition. And I think that the service industry as a whole is going to continue to have problems because we're going to see further shifts. As you know, I'm on the road on a coast-to-coast, border-to-border trip. Well, occasionally we eat out. We don't just eat, in our schoolie, but we don't want to go to restaurants anymore. So we just do Uber Eats. We get the restaurant, we just don't have to deal with the restaurant. All of a sudden they don't need servers. All they need is a kitchen.
Well, yeah, I think there's just like multiple things going on here. There's definitely the Uber Eats, DoorDash thing. I think also it's sort of hard to draw conclusions about what is happening right now because it's pretty unusual. A mass epidemic or pandemic, if you will. This is something that nobody alive right now has really experienced, or very, very few people. So I have to go back. I mean, in the United States, if you look at our history, the last pandemic was in 1918 to 1919, and
the flu,
the so-called Spanish influenza, which went across the country, killed an enormous number of people, including, for example, my great aunt's husband, who died during that. And so we just don't have this experience anymore. Now, one thing that if you look at, and this is something where I actually find the history of epidemics pretty interesting because they're these black swan events, and they have these sort of devastating effects on societies as well as the economies when they rise. But the interesting thing is that if you look at most epidemics, no matter what happens during the epidemic, people sooner or later just bounce back to whatever they were going to do to begin with. I'll give you an example. The famous plague of London, which occurred, let me see, I think in 1665, it's documented in Pepys' diaries. People just disappeared from the city. This was the same plague epidemic that caused Newton to leave college and go spend time at home thinking about gravity. So when these things happen, you think, hey, everything has changed. But then at some point, the pandemic or the epidemic dies down, people drift back into older patterns. So I'm still really interested to see whether things like remote work are really going to persist the way people think they are right now. And I'll give you a reason why I think things will bounce back. It's a really simple one. I think most companies cannot manage it well. And so at some point, they're just going to throw up their hands and say, hey, we need everybody back in the office because it's just too hard to manage like a large company in a distributed fashion. So I think you're going to see this, that you're going to see a counter movement, over the next couple of years as the pandemic fades, and there's a chance that it may end up looking just like what it was before. That's been the pattern in history before.
Well, but even with that pattern, there's a bit of an evolution that occurs, right? I agree with you. I don't think remote work is here to stay for large companies. But for example, Command Prompt's been 100% remote since like '04.
Right.
And that will never change. I mean,
right.
I'm kind of in the position that if our company were to become large enough to where remote work would no longer work or be effective and productive, that's when I start looking for a buyer.
Yep.
Because my life as a whole will not adjust to the idea of being in an office. That isn't to say, though, that, I mean, there's plenty of studies that show that it is a few and rare breed that can actually be productive in a remote scenario. It has enormous burden on mental health. It increases social anxieties because you're not around people enough, so you don't build up like the emotional calluses to be able to deal with, the generalist of society. And if you take something like a Google or a Microsoft or a Cisco, these companies that have tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of employees, that would be impossible to manage remote. It's one thing to manage a team. That's what we're dealing with, right? We're 20, 25 people. Managing a company of even, 1,000 people, it's going to create enormous overhead to do that remotely, because you can't just walk into a cubicle and work out through human interaction and visible, tells and things like that, whatever the problem is.
Yeah, I think that, I think one thing that there've been a couple things that I think are really positive about this sort of rethinking of work. And don't get me wrong, I mean, COVID has been awful. It has, there's like a long list of aside from people being sick and died, I think it's exacerbated tensions and at least in the United States and many other countries go on, you can go on at length. But I think two interesting things have come out of this. One is, I think that what you and I know is that you can be totally productive when you're remote. And you don't have to be in the same room as somebody to actually have a productive meeting with them, to share information. As long as you know each other, as long as you have, sort of mutual trust, as long as you have clear communication, there's now great technology that allows you to, I mean, just like what we're doing right now over the internet, we're able to communicate easily and get work done. So that's thing number one. You don't have to be in the office every single day to get work done. I think the second thing that, that I think people are realizing is that, we can use this as a way to deal with problems of things, like commuting, for example. There's just like in the Bay Area where I live, and in any large city in the United States, people just waste an enormous amount of time getting to and from work. So in fact, being able to allow people, some fraction of their time be at home, that's less carbon in the atmosphere, it's less wasted hours sitting in cars. And to be frank, there's a bunch of jobs we're having, particularly knowledge work, we're actually having some time where you can work undisturbed. It makes you more productive. And there's a fair amount of evidence, I think, that's coming out that this does have impact, and that people may be starting to rethink whether they have to be in the office, for example, 40 hours a week or day in, day out. I think that's, and I hope that stuff will stick in people's minds, because I think that's really positive.
I do too. I mean, things like the 4-day work week, for example.
Yeah.
They're starting to show that you actually don't gain any productivity in that last day, that last 8 hours, right? So why are we making people work that? Well, let's because you and I could probably talk about this for days, because there's just so many different corners to reach. But I'd like to kind of, based off of what we did just talk about, first, where are you based? And over the last year, with the pandemic and all of that, has it changed your lifestyle at all, and how you're productive?
That's a great question. So I'm located in the Bay Area, but I run a company that has 40 people, and we're completely remote. So we basically have we have 3 people on the Pacific Rim, sort of along the West Coast, and then we have people going all the way back to the Ural Mountains and India. Most of our people we have the largest group of people in Russia. We have almost as many people in the United States, and then a slightly smaller group in Canada. And then we're spread out over, like about 6 or 7, actually about 8 other countries. But I'm sort of sitting in the Bay Area. And to get to your question, the initial effect of the pandemic, as bad as it was nothing. We didn't change anything about the way we work. Other than the fact that we no longer traveled to things like conferences. That's been kind of interesting, and was, something that we had to get used to, that we would, for example, hire people and never meet them face to face. But beyond that, we just kept doing, what we were doing before. We were actually almost in an ideal position to deal with this kind of crisis, because we didn't depend on working together face to face every day.
No, I certainly understand that. I mean, command prompt is, as you know, has been remote, like I said, since I think '04.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the purposes of this coast-to-coast, border-to-border trip that we're on is to meet a bunch of our team members. And in fact, we even have an owner that I've never met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's one of the purposes of this trip, outside of just general community stuff of me, continuing to profess people Postgres data, and as well as, we have a professional and life and leadership project through command prompt called Intrepidus Vita, which is Latin for fearless life. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we're trying to portray to people is, don't always live in fear, take risks, enjoy your life. What's something that you're passionate about? So, for me, it's schoolies and travel and adventure, but what is something you're passionate about? It's got nothing to do with work, really.
Ski mountaineering. I had one of the, so you're a Northwest person. You've lived.
Oh yeah.
So my son actually went to school in Western Washington, in Bellingham, actually.
Really, so he went to Western.
Went to Western, did a geology degree there. Really loved it. He and I have spent a bunch of time skiing in the North Cascades. I used to live up in Seattle as well. So every year we try and do at least a couple of ski trips together. I'll come up and visit him. So this year our goal was to go to Mount Adams and get to the top. The last time we went there, my brother was there, and he kind of conked out, and we didn't make it to the top. So our goal was get to the top and then ski this amazing run called the Southwest Chutes, which is basically a 4,000 foot run down the southwest side of Mount Adams. So we did that over Memorial Day weekend. It was the most amazing day. And I think it was the weather, the conditions were great. And then just being there with one of my kids and just sharing the joy of being outside and sort of on this amazing mountain on this amazing day. It's like one of the best things I've done for years.
I need to say, I used to live in White Salmon, Washington, which is the gateway to Mount Adams.
The gateway to Trout Lake, as we would say.
Yes, the gateway to Trout Lake, which is, how you get to Mount Adams. And I have backpacked Mount Adams many times.
Oh my goodness.
In fact, the first time I ever got lost on trail was on Mount Adams. And so I completely understand, but I know this to be true. And so I have to ask, and please don't hate me for it, but aren't you getting a little old for that?
No.
I mean, you're in
No,
or
that's
out
oh
of
my god,
them.
oh my god. Well, my son, who's 23, says, when he was asked about this by somebody else, he said, yeah, my dad, he keeps up okay. So the first time we went up, the first time he and I went up Adams together to the fall summit, which we didn't get to the tippy top, but we got pretty darn close. I beat him up the head wall, and at the
Oh,
time I
nice.
was, I think, about 58, and so I'm 62 now. He beat me up this time, not by much. And I will say that one of the things that's really great when your kids grow up is after a while they do go faster and than you do, and they are stronger, and they do things that you can't do or don't do as well anymore. And I'll give you an example. My son is very, very good at navigating, and he also had one of these. He was smart enough to buy one of these Garmin navigational devices. And I think you know about this because you mentioned getting lost on Adams. It's really hard to find things on that mountain, particularly low down, where
Oh, yeah. It's all forested.
it's all forested, formless, like one little gully after another. He found the tent. It would have taken me an extra hour to find it when we were coming, because we were out for we were on the trail for over 12 hours to do this, get up to the top, ski down, and then circle back around the mountain to the tent. He found it. So I'm quite grateful to him for that.
That's great. Yeah, the first time I luckily ended up getting lost up into the Clear Springs campground.
Yes.
Even though that's nowhere near where I started, right?
Right.
So at least at that point, I had the ability to start just walking back.
Right.
And this was many, many moons ago, and a great old German couple picked me up. They're like, "Do you need a ride?" And I said, "Yes." And they're like, "So where's your car?" I'm like, "I don't exactly know." And so I very much got berated by an old German couple about how I didn't have enough water, I didn't have a compass, and that was the one and only time I ever went unprepared.
Right.
I should say underprepared, and I was lucky to get out the way I did. But that is great. It's snow mountaineering. That's unexpected, and I didn't know your history in the Pacific Northwest, which is also, that's my home. And so that was kind of cool as well.
Yeah. And, Josh, can I put in just an advertisement that, for you and I both know this because we've been there, but Mount Adams is one of the most amazing mountains on the planet. I love that place. I love the area around it. From the Columbia up, through White Salmon to Trout Lake, the area north of it, it's just glorious. And we're so lucky to be able to go there and experience it. And I hope other people.
Well, there's just so much national forest there too, right? Because you can actually get from Adams to Helens.
Yep.
Without ever perhaps not even seeing another human.
Right.
Right. It's a long trek, but you can do it.
You can do it.
So no, I agree. If you have a chance to go, you should. And just to be fair to those south of us down there, Mount Hood area is also awesome.
Oh, we love Mount Hood.
Yeah. Okay, so let's bounce back around. You are, like you said, the CEO of Altinity, which has something to do with ClickHouse. Let's talk about ClickHouse a little bit. What is the relationship between Altinity and ClickHouse?
Let me tell you first what ClickHouse is. So ClickHouse is a SQL data warehouse, and for people who maybe are not database geeks and are listening to this, what that means is it's a database that is designed to allow you to answer questions very quickly over very, very large data sets. And by very quickly, I mean that, hey, if you're typing in a random query, you'd like to get an answer back in a second. By very large, we mean maybe trillions of records. For example, they could be records of trades in a market. They could be records from a content delivery network. They could be records from logs from web servers. So this is what ClickHouse does. It answers these questions in a hurry. It's very interesting. These SQL data warehouses have traditionally been proprietary databases, so closed technology, open source. As we both know, databases like Postgres, like MySQL, opened up sort of the traditional relational databases long ago. But ClickHouse is really one of the first open source databases that that serve these needs, these specialized use cases. It was developed by Yandex, which is a company in Moscow. They sometimes call themselves the Russian Google. And to make a long story short, they built this for an in-house application called Metrica. It's kind of like Google Analytics. It works so well that they then used it for a bunch of other stuff, and then they open sourced it in 2016. And since then, it's been picked up by companies like eBay, Cloudflare, Cisco, you name it, just all kinds of, sort of hundreds of thousands of companies, both in the United States as well as worldwide. We support that database. We also market it, and we basically make this open source database and make it possible for enterprise users, so people in businesses who are developers and trying to build applications, for example, to manage networks. We make it possible for them to use ClickHouse effectively and solve problems that depend on being able to get fast answers out of a lot of data.
Okay, so honestly, I mean, really not unlike command prompt with Postgres.
Exactly.
In a lot of ways.
Well,
okay.
One difference is that we have a cloud service for this, so I don't know where command prompt stands on this. So we did start out in the traditional, sort of, I think the time-honored beginning was as an open source service bureau. There was this database. One of our founders, Alexander, is a really good friend of mine. He learned how to, he had one of the early installations in the United States, and he said, hey, this thing is fast, it's really efficient, but kind of rough around the edges. It needs some consulting and education to help people use it. So that's how we started. But then what we did was we built a server engineering group. We built 24/7 enterprise support. And then finally we introduced a cloud service so that, people can just basically use it as a service in the Amazon cloud and in a few days in Google.
Okay, yeah, that would be a little different. I mean, we obviously command prompt does all the professional services and 24/7 support and all that.
Yep.
But we support any service. We don't have our own cloud offering. In fact, if a client comes and goes, do you manage Postgres? We'll say, yes. Which cloud would you like it on?
Right.
That kind of thing. But this is interesting to me, though, because, Postgres, although it does do data warehouse stuff, it actually is very good at it to a point. It's not, say, a Greenplum. Mm-hmm. So my question, and for those who don't know, Greenplum is an open source. There's also an enterprise version. Fork of Postgres. It's it's an MPP style, multi-processor, multi-node type of data warehouse that is based on Postgres. I think it's currently based on 9.6 or 10, and they're working very quickly. Greenplum is owned by VMware to become code parity with vanilla Postgres. How would something like a ClickHouse compare to? Not architecturally, that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in what's the problem that ClickHouse can provide me that or solve the problem that ClickHouse can that, say, Greenplum can't or can't as well.
Well, I want to be totally fair because I'm not I have not used Greenplum in a really, really long time. But what I can tell you that what people like about ClickHouse that really kind of grabs them by the collar is three things. One, it's blindingly fast. And that's a marketing term, but what I mean is that let's take an example where, in fact, I'll take an example from an application I'm pretty familiar with. There's a company called Mux that has a content delivery network for video. And they're some of the folks that, among other things, handle the streaming for the Super Bowl, the big football game in February. So they have, as these streams are downloading, they're actually collecting metrics from a variety of locations, and they're sticking them into a ClickHouse database so that what they can do is they can load the data very fast. They can get it loaded into ClickHouse in seconds, have it immediately queryable. They can then sort of query what's going on in these streams in real time. So let's say that they're seeing like rebuffering events where people are having trouble, the streams are not coming down. Maybe there's some constriction in the network bandwidth. They can recognize and diagnose and fix these problems in real time because they have the analytics to solve it. And what this So this speed is the speed of ingest, being able to load something, have something happen in the real world and see it in your data warehouse within a second. That's possible to do. To be able to issue queries on very, very large data sets, that's another kind of speed. And then on top of that, it's extremely efficient. So whereas some data, many databases are, take a lot of resources to do that, ClickHouse is actually able to able to do this on a very, very small number of nodes. So that particular application might have maybe a dozen nodes tops. And the way that they do this is they have extremely high compression and then very, very efficient scans of the data. So that the database is just honed to be fast on minimal resources. And one final thing that you can do, which is part of the performance and efficiency, is if you design your application well, you can scale it linearly as the amount of data that you have goes up. And ClickHouse is very good at this. So for example, Cloudflare uses ClickHouse for a lot of their analytics, like DNS analytics and web analytics. They have a cluster which consists of, the last time, I haven't looked at it recently, but it's probably 150 to 100 to 150 nodes with tens of petabytes of data. It's an enormous, it's an enormous data size, and yet people, when their dashboards come up for Cloudflare, they basically get them populated in a second or two. They're able to maintain this in spite of the enormous amount of data that they're loading.
So that's interesting. To me, so there's been this in the database market. There's a constant tug, right, between say traditional databases and newer databases. Your snowflakes, for example, or your cockroaches, or even your Yugabytes. Even though they took a more traditional role, it's a globally distributed bidirectional database that supports Postgres. But you said a couple things there. One, you said it was highly compressed, and this is interesting to me because, not to start geeking out, and we'll keep the geeking part to a minimum, but one of the things that I think that a lot of people forget is that even the CPUs 5 years ago were fast. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about data, data structures and how you deal with that, as you know, I used to teach a lot. And I would run these courses on, for PostgreSQL, how to make Postgres fast. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what kind of CPU do you use? Blah, blah, blah. And one of the things I would remind people, I'm like, look, I don't care if you're running a Xeon from, say, 4 years ago, because that Xeon from 4 years ago is more than fast enough to deal with what you're dealing with. Because in the Postgres architecture, it wasn't the speed of CPU that was important. It was how many cores you had. It was the number of CPUs that you had. And especially nowadays with Postgres and its efficiency, I would take, 128 core CPU if they existed, but 128 core CPU that was, say, 5 years or even 10 years old over, say, a brand new processor that only had, say, 12 cores, right? Just because of the nature of the architecture. Now, and the reason I bring this up is because there is one place where the speed of your CPU matters in this discussion, and that is the ability to uncompress data, analyze it, and recompress data on the fly. And you are storing compressed streams or compressed pages, is that correct?
Compressed columns, actually. So they're stored as, you can think of them as just for every column in the data, because it is a columnar store. So, and we don't try, like ClickHouse doesn't try to do what Postgres does so well, which is to do transaction processing. We don't even have a real SQL delete command yet. Delete is an offline, not an offline, but an asynchronous operation. So what we're trying to do is just basically organize things in columns and then compress those columns as efficiently as possible, and then parallelize as much as we can. So yeah, and if you look at the differences between CPUs, like a fast one versus a slow one, the individual cores, it might be 2x, that's actually not a big difference if you can actually parallelize, so that instead of, like if you need it, instead of using 10 CPUs, 10 cores, you can get 100 or 200 or 300, working on the same, in parallel on the same problem. So that's really where ClickHouse goes, and the things that you look at, if we the optimizations inside ClickHouse are kind of amazing. There's everything from using SIMD instructions, so single instruction multiple data, which will allow you to take something like a passengers in taxi cars, for example, which might be stored as bytes. And if you're summing them up to see how many passengers rode in a month, you can push 8 of these guys onto a single register and do that sum at once. Then there are things like just making sure you have cache alignment. Columns align very well in CPU caches. We pay attention to that. The caches, we also align very well with memory, so that we can basically grab parts of memory, and if you load something in, you load it into like an L3 cache, that because you're scanning the column, the stuff that you're going to look for is actually going to be in the L3 cache when you need it. So it's not just alignment, but it's the fact that we organize the data in a way that maximizes the throughput achievable using things like caches. And then on top of that, we have a lot of, we try and be as efficient as possible by using things like memory. So we do streaming operations where we're basically just grabbing the bytes, decompressing them, do whatever operation we have, and then move on, but minimizing the amount of memory that we're holding at any given time, not having to, we don't have a buffer cache the way MySQL does. We don't have to page things in explicitly. There's just like a huge number of optimizations that go into making this thing as fast as it is. I mean, I'm geeking out, but I've worked with a lot of databases, and there've been 3 that I've truly loved. The first was Sybase. The second was MySQL. Sorry, I like Postgres too. I love MySQL, and the third one is ClickHouse. It's a wonderful database. I love working with it.
Well, I can certainly forgive your love for MySQL. Dolphins are cute. But it's interesting that you bring up Sybase, because a lot of people are like, aren't they dead? Well, no, in fact, that they're not. They're actually a relatively healthy company. They're not growing like they used to, of course. And obviously with Microsoft SQL being protocol compatible, that's going to further eroded some of their market. And then, but what's happening now, and this is interesting to me, and I'm sure, I don't know if you've followed this, but Amazon is working on a Postgres patch or fork, depending on what happens with the community, that will basically drop a Microsoft SQL / Sybase compatible Postgres open source into the market. It's called Babel, or Babelfish, I think it is, and it's not out yet. But they're working on it, and they're trying to work with the community to allow certain protocol hooks and stuff so that they don't, have to do certain over engineering. But it reminds me of what Enterprise DB did, of course, which is create this somewhat Oracle compatible version of Postgres. But going after the Microsoft SQL / Sybase market, that's actually more interesting to me, because it really talks to the types of installations Postgres would be good at replacing.
Yep. I think if you could do that, that would be wonderful. And I'll tell you what, like if you ask me, like, well, why did you like those 3 databases? I think one thing that Microsoft SQL Server, the Sybase SQL Server, Microsoft, MySQL, and then ClickHouse, they all have these kind of loosey-goosey dialects, which are kind of user-friendly. T-SQL is a good example of a dialect which I've just always found pretty easy to remember and use. And, it's almost had a kind of, compared to Oracle PL SQL, it had a kind of scripty feeling to it, even right at the beginning. And so, yeah, I think if Postgres had that, I would have to think that would be popular. It's a really, I like that dialect of SQL. I think it's pretty pleasant to use.
You're killing me here. Every database engineer that listens to this head just exploded with the idea of a loosey-goosey SQL dialect.
Yeah, they do.
But you're not wrong. right?
Yeah.
And this is something that PostgreSQL has struggled with for years, is
Yeah.
this idea of user friendliness
Yep.
versus engineering correctness.
Yep. Yep.
What are a
Yeah.
couple of things, with ClickHouse, you're prioritizing user friendliness. How would, as a Postgres person, if someone who's written a book on Postgres, co-authored, someone who's done it for his, the majority of his professional career, there's a certain mindset that comes along with doing things a certain way. And we get stuck in that as we get older too. So if I go to ClickHouse, I have a client tomorrow that says, look, man, I'm trying to do exactly what you're telling me about ClickHouse. I need instant responses. And, when I go through that, my head goes, so we need a caching layer. We need predictive analysis, blah, 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 blah. And what you're telling me is, no, JD, all you need is a broker to take logical streams from Postgres to feed into ClickHouse, and ClickHouse will answer all your questions. How does that feel to me? Like, as someone like me, someone who has a pedantic, strict idea of correctness for working within data. Is ClickHouse that far off?
In some ways it is. And I think if you look at what the design center for ClickHouse really is, it's speed. And that comes back to the original author of ClickHouse, and the lead committer is Alexei Milovidov, who's now working for ClickHouse Incorporated. And his focus has been, let's make this thing run as fast as humanly possible. And once we get that, we're going to make it even faster. We talk about, in fact, ClickHouse has its motto is, in Russian, is ClickHouse не тормозит, which means ClickHouse doesn't slow things down. ClickHouse doesn't break in the sense of hitting the brakes. This thing just, and the way I always translate it is, ClickHouse runs like a bat out of hell. So that's the design center. What did we give up? Well, I'll give you an example. We gave up transactions in the sense that they're understood in a database like Postgres or MySQL. We don't have ACID transactions. At this time, we're still working to get full auto commit. So for example, if you load data into a source table and you have materialized views feed on it, the materialized views trigger automatically as your blocks get loaded. If something blows up in the middle, you can be left with dirty data. And this, if you're building something that's doing e-commerce, this will be a complete disaster. It turns out that in analytic applications, it just isn't that big a problem, because you can construct things in a way that failures are relatively rare. And there are ways of, sort of patching things up and retrying. So for example, ClickHouse does have what's called deduplication, which if it sees a block that's been loaded before, based on, it hashes them and so that it can remember what it's loaded. If it sees it appear again, it says, oh, somebody must be just retrying, I'll throw that away. So, so that's the kind of trade-offs that ClickHouse has made. Another trade-off we made is we didn't include a full dialect of SQL. The focus was on getting select to work and then getting the parts of select that people really needed to work. So for example, window functions, they're there now, but they were a really late addition. Common table expressions, another really late addition. We still don't, we're working on getting a proper SQL delete command. SQL update command is still done in an asynchronous way using slightly different syntax. So those were the sacrifices that we made. And I think that, coming from the same background as you, when I first saw this, I thought, hey, can this really work? But what I found is that it just turns out that kind of, when you're dealing with analytic data, you tend not to have, it's usually you're loading things like event streams. And so, for example, you don't have conflicts. You don't have this case where multiple people are trying to get at and update the same thing simultaneously. The data have no relation. It's just like a bunch of facts coming in for measurements, for example. As long as you get them loaded as fast as possible, you'll never have a conflict.
So it's interesting that you say some of the sacrifices you've made, but in some ways, it doesn't sound like a sacrifice as much as, targeting a specific user experience. And you've gone back to this multiple times,
right.
Is that you want people to get their answers quickly.
Yep.
But one sacrifice I think you did make is in an optimization. And you said that you support SIMD.
Yes.
That, I believe, and I could be wrong, I'm a little rusty on my architectures, but that limits your architectures to basically Intel, and I think AMD has an equivalent
Yeah,
as AMD.
yeah,
But
Intel
doesn't that?
compatible. Intel compatible. It does exist. I don't know ARM very well. We don't actually run much on ARM. That's actually, kind of a future. Uh, so so we're actually not. I mean, that's something that is not the only thing that we depend on for speed. There are many, many other optimizations. So
Oh,
we can still
sure.
run really fast on ARM, even if we don't have that fully implemented.
Okay. Well, let's continue down this road because you have this interesting situation where ClickHouse is open source, and now there's an ecosystem building up around it. Your company is one, ClickHouse Inc. is one. That has a similar idea with Postgres, where you have your enterprise DBs and your command prompts, and that's really all you've got left in the United States, except for, say, VMware. But there's a professional community, right, that you need to truly make this successful. I mean, Microsoft, the famous Steve Ballmer, developers. Well, what a lot of people made fun of that, but what Microsoft was doing and is doing is making sure that they have a professional ecosystem and community that supports the people that are actually creating for these products. And as you know, Command Prompt helps run Postgres Conference, and it's where the professionals go that are going to a Postgres conference, where they want to learn about how to solve problems and build things with Postgres. Is your company working in that direction, or do you have another way that you're trying that's kind of prioritizing your community building?
Actually, I think as I understood what you described, we are definitely prioritizing building the community. I mean, we do as a business, we do two things. We promote ClickHouse because as great as we think ClickHouse is, not everybody knows that. I went to an All Things Open conference a couple of years ago, talked to 90 people on the floor at our booth. I think 2 had heard of ClickHouse. So there's that. That's changing. I think that story is getting out. We're seeing sort of large scale VC funding and entering the market. The second thing, of course, then is we get our message out. But I do think, I want to just focus on open source because I think that the ClickHouse is very similar to Postgres in the sense that it's not truly owned by anybody. Yandex, built it, was a steward of it, but the community that has built up around it is enormous. So at the beginning of this year, or perhaps even last year, we overtook Elasticsearch as having the largest number of committers on the project. And by that, I mean somebody who, did a pull request that actually got merged. This year, we're going to be well over 300 people. Elastic is around 300. So there's a huge worldwide community that's driven by people who are building applications and need stuff in ClickHouse, so they put it in themselves. We get a lot of we get a lot of commits from Eastern Europe, partly because that's the origin. They come here from the United States. They come from China. They basically come all over. So this open source community is this driver of technology, and it is really large. So it's, in my opinion, it's past the point where it can be dominated by a single company. Even though it's possible in the future somebody will try to do that, I think it's gotten beyond that stage.
Well, that's good. I mean, in my mind, as someone who's been in open source for decades, that is what produces the best result, right? Where you have just enough friendliness and just enough friction, co-opetition is a term that's used, that you'll have two companies, preferably half a dozen, but you'll have half a dozen at least companies that are all driving a specific direction in the market for a particular piece of software. In this, ClickHouse is doing analytics and data warehousing, but it may be that you have a company that pops up that focuses on that with ClickHouse for, say, healthcare, and another one for, say, fintech. But what ends up happening is that it grows the community as a whole, which makes the project healthier. It makes the companies themselves healthier because, as anybody who knows business knows, if there's only one company delivering the solution, that company will get lazy.
Absolutely.
And worse, when the competition starts to appear because they've gotten lazy, they'll get predatory. It's almost like a natural reaction. I think that there's a lot of companies out there that they make these decisions that are, say, predatory. That wasn't the intention. It's reactionary as they are trying to readjust. And a good example is Microsoft today versus Microsoft of, say, 1996.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
totally different companies.
Yeah, I feel really strongly. I mean, I think the thing about these Kubernetes is another example of a broad, an enormous, and Linux, of course. These are enormous communities, and I think the fact that so many companies have been participating in them and then building products, often competing on top of them, has been really good for users. It's so like in people used to ask me, "Aren't you afraid of Amazon coming into this market?" And my answer for ClickHouse is, well, get in line. There's, to my knowledge, at least 7 cloud services for ClickHouse. The largest ones that we know of are in China, but Yandex has one. We have one. There's a couple other competitors that have them. Hey, everybody's going to do this. So what we need to do is compete on what's built on top. What's the level of experience that we afford our users? What are the tools that we give them? How do we make them and enable them to build applications without having to worry very much about what's underneath their apps and processing their data? And that's where we should compete if we want to serve their needs.
Well, there's certainly the technical and business side, but there's the people side too.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts or goals on bringing people together through your company? What do you got going on there?
Well, so we run the ClickHouse meetup in San Francisco, which is the only regular US based meetup. We've got one next week, by the way, if anybody wants to come. We do them every couple months. Our goal is basically to bring people into the community and share. And I think I like open source a lot. I've worked on it for now since 2006. Actually, that's, let me think about that. Since 2006, so about 15 years. What I like about open source communities is the openness and the fact that, if you're like me, I like to know how things work inside. I like to understand the plumbing. How does data actually get written to the disk? How does the transaction processing actually work? What's the locking mechanism? Well, in open source, you can find the person who wrote that code, and there's a good chance they'll do a talk soon and explain it. So we try and promote and foster that kind of feeling. And, based on other communities that we've seen, Postgres, MySQL, these are communities that basically, encourage people to join and then helped explain things, give them the tools so that they could also become contributing members. So we're very focused on enabling that to happen with ClickHouse. And I think the results speak for themselves. We can't take credit for it. I think or at least not entirely, I think one of the Alexei Milovidov, the guy that leads the project, is a big open source person. And I think his attitude about creating community has been one of the reasons the database is so popular.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I run the Silicon Valley Postgres meetup. Is your ClickHouse meetup, is it in person next week?
No, we've gone to this is an interesting COVID thing. So we had our last in-person one, I think, back in February of 2019. We went online and we've just stayed there. The weird thing is I think we may never come back, may never go back on person again, because what's happened is it's morphed into an international English language ClickHouse meetup. We now get people dropping in to do lightning talks from India. We get people sometimes that show up from China. It's turned into this, sort of worldwide meetup, and it's actually a really cool development. So yeah, we lose the serendipity of meeting somebody in the room, but we also have this new serendipity of, hey, there's somebody in Italy or something, someplace like that who's doing something kind of cool with ClickHouse, you can get together online and find out what that person is doing, and they'll explain it.
Okay, so do me, I don't want to distract from our process here, but get to me offline. I'd love to promote that ClickHouse meetup to the Silicon Valley group.
Sure.
There's obviously cross-pollination there. It'd be interesting.
Yeah.
And so let's definitely get to that and break. Robert, I'm trying to get you to talk about your conference.
I'm glad you asked. So yeah, that's the other thing we're doing in terms of building community. That we're focused on building the ClickHouse community, of course, because that's our business and we work in every day. But what we also think is there's a bigger community around analytics. And so we've organized a conference called OSACon, Open Source Analytic Conference. And what we're doing is bringing together people who work in all sort of lead projects that handle all parts of analytic applications. So that's ingest, query, and visualization. We're bringing those people together with the folks that build the applications. So we have talks from people, for example, we have committers, a panel discussion of committers from major databases. That's at the database end. We then have people doing, talks on how they use ClickHouse to process satellite data, sort of using these things in the field. And what we're hoping to do is get some synergy going, even more synergy going, not just within projects, but across projects, as people begin to learn from each other, see what different projects have done, for example, in query optimization, that things that they can take home and apply to their own projects. We're hoping to, sort of build a broader community that's focused on these analytical problems.
Okay. Well, hey, we're kind of getting up on a deadline here of time, but I did want to address this as we're closing this out. One thing that I think is particularly useful, there's two items here. One is the relationship between being profitable and being useful. I, for a long time, and not originally I tried to go the VC route and, get rich and go public, and at the time they weren't called this, but be a unicorn, all that type of stuff. That was decades ago. And I've evolved and matured to a business policy that the profit that we receive through command prompts is the reward for good works. It's not the goal, it's the reward. So to you, what is the relationship between being profitable and being useful?
I think you become profitable by being useful, which is essentially the view that you've just described. So I think that at one way to look at what it means if a company is profitable is that you're doing something that your users value. And that's very much how we focus on it. We try and understand what it is they need and then deliver it to them as efficiently as possible. And in a nutshell, what our customers need is they need applications that actually work and help them understand the world. That's what analytics is about. And so if they can deliver those applications, they're successful. So everything we do, when we get down to in the ground level, do we put, features in the database, to tool, visualization tools we integrate with, the things we do in our cloud platform, it's trying to meet that goal of enabling our users to develop and deploy successful applications.
Fair enough. And I would agree that that's basically, and I think there are exceptions. I think that there's a point where a company can lose its way and people aren't necessarily using it because it's useful. It's just become either too expensive to migrate out of the platform.
Right.
I can think of certain databases that are like that. But also, an inertia, why change?
Mm-hmm.
But, you and I were both getting older. We've known each other since we were younger men. And, this is something I just straight up, I have personally struggled with this over the last couple of years, mainly not so much the ability to keep up with the tech as much as the desire. There isn't, I don't have as much drive to be on the forefront. And a lot of that is, I too am a CEO, and I have a whole team to do that for me. But certainly intellectually, we want to stay sharp. And, studies have shown that once you get into your late 40s, things, everything starts to slow down a little bit and starts to hurt a little bit too. And so how do you stay sharp? I mean, you mentioned earlier you're 62, which in my mind is not old, but it's certainly not young. So what are you doing to keep up with, the youngs out there?
I think there's two things. One, you have to just stay curious. As I said, I like to know how things work inside. So if I meet up something new, I want to understand it. And it makes me crazy until I do. So, I keep iterating on stuff. On the database stuff, I don't get to write code. I do teach our ClickHouse 101 class, which I developed. We have 2 database classes we teach. So I keep my hand in that way. And I answer support cases. So stay curious. I think the other thing is that there's a point where what you can offer is not necessarily, sure, I can code stuff, but what I can also do is I've been at this for a really long time. And so what I try to do is distill what I've learned and translate that to what other people are doing so that they make better decisions and we have overall better outcomes. And that's something where it's a kind of, it sort of becomes more mentoring, and actually giving back in some cases, like, teaching design classes at the University of Davis, for example. So that's the second thing that I do, which is just try and, not have to do everything, but instead enable people to solve problems themselves in a good way. And I find that incredibly satisfactory. And it turns out not to be it's not a particularly easy problem to do that consistently. So there's a lot of pleasure in just seeing that happen. I mean, the best still for me, that after I've been programming, next January, it'll be 50 years. For me, the best point is when in any project is when this bloody complicated thing just starts to work. And there's this sort of magical moment where it's like, wow, it actually works. And then you feel this sort of joy. And of course, you still got to test it and everything like that. But that's still, I'm still motivated by that, 49 years and 10 months later.
Let's be fair. There's also that moment of dread because you don't know why it works.
Yes,
right?
Or why it's not working.
That's Perl developers know this one well. Okay, so, and hey, mentorship, I agree with that entirely. I think that the best thing that we can give the youngs is the benefit of our experience, because if they learn from it, hopefully they will make their own mistakes, but hopefully they'll make the mistakes that we made, and it allows them to accelerate the maturity of being in the business process. And it pays it forward, right?
Absolutely.
None of us got where we were without help of some kind.
Yeah.
So the last thing, and then we're going to wrap this up. One of the things that we are big on this podcast, and we delved into it on a number of occasions with different guests. We had Mark Porter, CTO of MongoDB, on recently. And he was very, very big into this. And in fact, the episode went so well, we had a second episode, and I would love to do that with you as well, kind of a bonus episode just to talk about kind of, individual and professional development. What are your thoughts on, we've run into problems with, and I keep calling them youngs, and all I mean by that is folks that are, I don't want to say new, but let's call it a decade or under in their professional world, right? We've run into problems with them not understanding, and frankly, even people that have been in it for a couple of decades, but not understanding professional development, not understanding its purpose, I've actually had an engineer look at me and say, I am a badass engineer. Why are you having me take a leadership class? Well, to me, it's obvious. If you take a leadership class, you can be more than a badass engineer. Right. So for you, what tools would you recommend, and what is your ideology around professional development with your teams and personally?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because we've actually, as our team has gotten larger, once we crossed, you know, last year we hit a point where we had 25 people, and all of a sudden it was a lot harder to keep track of what people were doing, and two, to make sure that we were bringing them up to speed. And I don't just mean, like on our products, but also on technology in general. So one of the things that I think is really important is you have to, if people are going to stay productive and become more productive over time, they have to educate themselves. And you have to have policies that encourage people to do that and make it easy to do so. So we actually realized we just needed to hire somebody whose job was to help do that, to help, sort of organize activities, organize classes. We've introduced, we're getting subscriptions to things like Udemy, and just making it possible for people to learn and to also give them some breathing space. We have one of our best guys in the QA group is actually on academic leave while he's finishing his master's degree. We really believe in that, and I think it's the same way that you want to make it possible for people to have family lives while they're working for your company. You need to make sure that they also have the opportunity to learn. I see those things as very, very similar problems, and you have to take similar philosophies. Just make it possible for motivated people to do this.
I would agree 100%. And one of the things that a lot of companies forget is that, and unfortunately, this has caused a blowback among certain people, is that there is no work-life balance. It's life balance, right? And work is part of life, but so is your family. So is the ability for you to go get a beer with a friend, right? It's about having a holistic, comprehensive view of a positive and productive life, of which work is part of it. But when you forget that, John has a new son, or Jane's daughter's about to graduate from college, or the bad side, right? Someone's going through a divorce, someone has a death in the family. You have to take all of these things into account. And remember, in the end, your assets, right, are not your house. It's not how many cars you own. It's not how many zeros are in your bank account. Your number one asset is the people you surround yourself with. And you have to love those people, even if it's just as, this person's a great engineer and I love them for that. But you have to remember that they are people, which means they're not perfect, and they sometimes need a hand up. With that, I'd like to close this out and thank Robert. You have been an excellent guest. I would like to have you on a bonus episode if you're interested. This has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it.